Okay, so welcome back. Now recently we've been talking about building this very simple application you see here, C Visual Studio WinForms. And what it allows you to do is to read in a binary file and display it as what you see here. On the left, you can see each byte displayed as hexadecimal characters in kind of a spreadsheet here. And on the right, we've got the same bytes as ASCII characters. If it can convert it to ASCII characters, it displays it here on the right. And one of the primary controls that we're using in Windows Forms to do this is what's called a DataGridView. And what we're going to talk about in this series of videos is the basics and how to use DataGridViews. They are really very, very powerful, but they can get kind of complicated. Now what we've got here is on the left, as we said, we've got a DataGridView that displays the hexadecimal version of the bytes read from the file. And on the right, the same bytes displayed as ASCII characters. And what we can do is we can kind of tie these two DataGridViews together, whereas you can see we can select multiple bytes on the left-hand DataGridView and the same bytes get selected on the right-hand view. And I can scroll both at the same time. So there's a lot of functionality going on with the DataGridViews, with events, and we're going to talk about that in this series. So like we say, it can get very complicated with DataGridViews because they got so many features, so we're going to break it down and make it very simple to show you how you can implement those in your software. So let's start with a blank C Visual Studio WinForms application. And here what I've got is I've just gone to the toolbox, search for DataGridView, and just drag and drop that onto our form, and that's the DataGridView, this gray box. I've also added a button and the event handler. All it's going to do is it's going to configure this DataGridView. Now we said the DataGridView is like a spreadsheet in Excel. However, the default DataGridView is just this gray box, so there's no spreadsheet. You're going to have to configure it in your application. So let's first go into our application and run it. And I'm going to configure this so when I click this Add Data button, it will configure the DataGridView however we want it. So right now I add data, it does nothing. This is just the default DataGridView and there's no spreadsheet, it's just a gray box. So the first thing we can do is build the spreadsheet in the DataGridView. And to do that, like I say, I'm going to call this configure DataGridView method. And we're going to step through it and start adding functionality to figure out how this works. So the first thing I want to do is I want to tell it that I want a spreadsheet that has 10 rows and 10 columns. So the DataGridView, the default name is DataGridView1. And I'm going to set the number of columns as 10 by using the DataGridView1 column count equals 10. And same thing with rows, the row count equals 10. Then I'll run it and add data to run that. And now you can see it has generated a spreadsheet with 10 rows and 10 columns. All right, so that is your default DataGridView after you've specified the rows and columns. Now you can see each one of these cells, I can select them. I can select multiple cells by default. And it's going to be very important you understand the concept of cells because these are very complicated objects that have properties. So for example, this cell has a property of what column it's in, the column number, the row number, and it's got a lot of functionality that you can set up. When you select it, you can have events. So you got to keep in mind that the cell is a very important object, and we've also got rows and we've got columns. Now you can also notice that on the very top, we've got what are called headers. So we've got column headers and we've got row headers. So those can be used to put names to the columns and the rows if you want, or you can make the headers disappear like we had in our application, and all we show is the cells with the rows and the columns. So now that we've got our basic spreadsheet, let's figure out how we can start adding data to the spreadsheet. So the first thing we can do is I'm going to uncomment these lines and I'm going to define a string called val, which has the value of value, and a double called val1 with a value of 12.3. And I'm going to put those two values in certain cells in our spreadsheet. So I'm going to say DataGridView1 rows 0 dot cells 0, and that defines the first row and the first cell in that row. And I'm going to say the dot value equals value 1. So you don't have to tell it anything, just it's going to accept whatever that value type is. In our case, this one's a string, so it's going to accept that as the value in that cell. I can do the same in the same row, but in cell 1, which is moving over one column, say the value is val1, and that should be 12.3. So now I can run this and add data, and now you can see it has put value in this first cell and 12.3 in the second cell. So that is the basic way that you can add data to the cells. You're probably not going to do that. You're probably going to add like lists or arrays or whatever, but that's the basics behind adding data. Now we notice that the font on those cells is really, really small. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncomment this line, which is DataGridView1 default cell style dot font. Now you can set a default style for all of the cells in your DataGrid view, and what we're going to do is we're going to use that default cell style, and we're going to use the dot font property and define the default font for all of the cells. And we're going to define a new font. We're going to use Tahoma size 16 and run that, add data, and now you can see it's got a much bigger font. It's this new font. So all of these cells will now have that new font. Now you can change individual cells, but that just gives us a default cell font. Now we can also add data to the headers for the rows and the columns. So to add names to the column headers, I'm going to uncomment these. Again, we're DataGrid view column 0 and columns 1. The header text will be column 0 or column 1 string. So we'll run that, add data, and now you can see that it has in the default header font, it has put column 0 and column 1. The default cell font that we defined is different from the header font. So you got to be aware of that. So you'd have to go in and change the default font for the columns and the rows. So now we can do the same thing for the rows and say DataGrid view rows 0 and rows 1 header cell dot value. So it's different from the header text that's used in the columns. This is a header cell dot value, and we're going to name it row 0 and row 1. So we can run that, add data, and now it has added that text, but you can see we have to expand that to get those visible. Now you can see that we can hover over the column dividers to expand that. We can do the same for the row dividers to expand those, or we can do that programmatically. So now we've got data in the cells, we have put names to the rows and headers, and in order to change the font for the column headers and row headers, what we will do is we will uncomment these, and this is DataGridView1 column headers default cell style dot font and row headers default cell style dot font, and again we're going to define a new font for those. So again, you can see this gets kind of complicated because depending on whether you're working on columns or rows, you might have different formatting of the code in order to set these values. So unfortunately, you got to know about these, and that's why it's nice to make kind of a class to configure this, so you can just put in the values and not have to worry about the format of the syntax of the code. So here we're going to set the cell style for the column headers and row headers, run that, add data, and now we have set the larger font for both of these, and now all of the cells and the headers have the same font. And you can see where we're going to want to go through to these cells and change the format so that they will automatically resize if we increase the size of the text. So now another thing we might want to think about is seeing if there's some way to auto size these columns. So for example, if we expand the size of our form, it would be nice if the columns fit inside this data grid view. So again, we've got two things. We've got the spreadsheet itself, but we've got the control, the data grid view, which is the gray behind it. So let's see if we can find a way to auto size the columns to fit horizontally into the data grid view. So what I'll do is I'll go down here and uncomment this line that says data grid view 1 auto size columns mode, and it's data grid view auto size columns mode dot fill. And that says the column widths adjust so that the widths of all the columns exactly fill the display area of the control. So let's run that. Add data, and now you can see it has automatically sized the 10 columns to fit horizontally in the control. And if we expand it, that will automatically contain those columns. Now, it'd be nice if we can do the same thing for the rows. Unfortunately, as you'll see with Data Grid View, the rows are handled a little bit different than the columns. It's not quite as easy. So what we'll do is we'll go in here, and what we have to do is we basically have to calculate the height of the rows relative to the height of the control, called the client rectangle. So we got to figure out the height of the data grid view and then make the height of the rows a fraction of that so that they all fit together. So these lines of code we're going to uncomment, and the first thing we do is we do data grid view 1 auto size rows mode, and we're going to say data grid view auto size rows mode is none. So that means it's not going to automatically calculate. We're going to do the calculation. And to do it, we're going to say for each data grid view row in data grid view 1 dot rows, so that's the collection of rows in our data grid view 1. So for each row, we're going to calculate the height. And the row dot height is the client rectangle height of the data grid view 1 minus the column headers height. So that's going to leave just the height of the rows. Divide that by the data grid view rows dot count. So it's going to divide the height by the number of rows and give us, hopefully, a height of each row that will fit exactly into the vertical area of the data grid view control. So we'll run that, add data, and now we see that initially this fits in exactly horizontally and vertically. We've got the columns and the rows. However, one thing left is if I resize this vertically, the rows don't resize. They only did it once when we initialize, but now we have to set up an event, a resize event handler, so that we do that recalculation each time we resize it vertically. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the data grid view, we'll go into the events and go to the size changed event and double click on that, the data grid view 1 size changed event, and we will add very similar code to calculate the new size. So for each row in data grid view rows, we're going to do that same calculation, but we're going to do it each time we resize. So we'll run that, add data, and now as we resize, we're doing both a vertical row resizing and a horizontal column resizing. So it can get kind of complicated, but again, that's why it's really nice if you can put all of this code behind the scenes in a class and just feed it some input properties and it will do it automatically. So in the next videos in this series, we're going to start looking at how can I set the data source for our data grid view. So for example, if we have a list of data or arrays of data or a database, how do I set that as the source of the data for my spreadsheet? And then we're going to look at something really, really important, which is events. So for example, if I select cells, I can generate events and I can operate on those cells as the events occur. So events are really, really important. And we'll look at other things in future videos in the series. So if you're liking these videos, I encourage you to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, but most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.